Thank you. Good afternoon. I just want to clarify that the discussion of second principles will be down the hall. We'll be discussing third and fourth principles in the bar later. And this is a discussion of first principles. It was back leading up to the election of 2008 that we at Heritage had the idea that there was something brewing that needed to be responded to, and we wanted to establish an initiative to orient America as much as we could back to its founding ideas, to restore a sense of what Jefferson called an expression of the American mind, by which he meant a deep understanding of the core principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, but in very general terms, in terms of a citizen. And that's what we wanted to do. For that initiative, we chose to use the term first principles, which is now broadly used. But we chose the term, and the term is used by the founders themselves, hence our use of it, during the period after the Declaration of Independence, the success of the Revolution, during the Confederation period, when Washington and others were receiving letters with great rapidity, arguing that indeed the American Revolution had failed. And the American experiment turned out to be one that was incapable of working. But several of the founders, Madison, Washington himself, said it is time, in times like these, when we are threatened with the demise of our republic, that we must return to our first principles. We must revert to our first principles. That's the sense in which we mean it today. Not that we want to go back to the 18th century, but that we want to revert to those ideas as a way to reorient our country, to repoint it to its North Star, to give it a compass, to guide it out to the problems we face today. So we want to go back to those revolutionary principles: liberty, equality, rightly understood, nature, grounding for moral ideas, consent, principles of the Declaration, but of course, those principles secured in the great framework of the United States Constitution. The rule of law, written constitutionalism. The structure of constitutionalism, things like the separation of powers, the idea that there are coordinate branches that have particular powers. Federalism, the idea that we are not a centralized national government. The themes of limited government. And all of those, of course, pointing to the grand theme of America, self-government. Here, as Hamilton once said, here we govern ourselves. Free enterprise, character-forming institutions shaping ourselves and our families and our lives. Independence in the world. These are the ideas that gave rise to the American dream, the real American dream. What about opportunity and upward mobility that attracts so many to our shores? And these are ideas that truly make America exceptional. And those ideas, of course, came under grave attack with the rise of progressivism at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. When American intellectuals did what they often do, they went to Europe looking for better ideas. And they brought them back and revived and built a new argument, which they called for the creation of a new republic, about evolving rights, about all things that change, and about living constitutions. That gave rise to a different dream, one that we're seeing played out today in the modern liberal state. One that vastly overspends and centralized control in Washington and is devastating for massive numbers of Americans, especially those who are most in need of the services and help of civil society. First Principles has had a comeback, fortunately, having roots in the conservative movement itself, going back to names like Ella Root and William Howard Taft, and especially someone named Calvin Coolidge, in my opinion, one of the greatest presidents of the 20th century. Second only to Ronald Reagan, of course, Mr. Meese. But also the conservative movement itself. Russell Kirk wrote about the roots of American order. Hayek wrote a book called The Constitution of Liberty. The Road to Serfdom is a great attack on a modern administrative state. And then there was a rising scholars, a group of scholars in the 60s and 70s that pushed back against Baird's thesis of the Constitution, and that established a conservative argument about America in its defense, but also as the root of our liberties. We see that burst onto the political field. It was late prior to that, but it really burst into the field in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan. Just read his first inaugural. the one who talks about, in which talks about us building a conservative movement and conservative ideas on the shoulders of our founders. And of course, it came into life in a very particular way when Ronald Reagan, as Attorney General, decided to pick a fight over the meaning of the Constitution with then sitting justices of the United States Supreme Court. And then, of course, it has had renewed emphasis lately. One of the most important things for the First Principles movement in America has been none other than Barack Obama. His attack on America, his attempt to redefine it and transform it, gave rise to that great Tea Party movement. Who would have thought that Americans in great numbers would go around having conventions and demonstrations, flaming Gadsden flags and waving a pocket constitution? And that leads us to where we are today. A debate over what America means. American politics is always historically a debate over that thing. What do those principles mean today, and how does it play out in our politics? Barack Obama has an idea. He clearly wants to claim it for himself. Read his second inaugural. Well, it starts by quoting the Constitution. But it's clearly a progressive argument, because all things change in his idea. First principles are more important than ever. They must be argued in the square to prevent the liberal claim on those ideas. We must defend them. They are also, in my opinion, the greatest source of conservative fusion, not just about coexistence, but a deeper grounding in ideas. They provide a ground for our arguments, both philosophically and in a constitutional framework, and I believe they're a ground for modern arguments about policies such as opportunity, social mobility, and reform that can guide us in the future. These ideas, the past, the first principles, where it comes from, where they are today in the debate in modern American politics, and where we're going with those ideas and how they might shape American politics and conservatism is what we want to talk about today. And for that, we have a very good panel of distinguished thinkers, all friends, who are, all in their own ways, deeply expert not only on first principles and American constitutionalism, but American politics itself. We're actually going to go in alphabetical order, among other reasons, so that Ed Meese can be our wrap-up speaker to our delight. And first kick off with Ken Blackwell, who has already been briefly introduced, coming up as the mayor of Cincinnati, up to and through that, and serving in government office, going back to be treasurer, and of course 2 terms as Secretary of State, and my choice for governor of that great state. Ken, thank you.
Thanks very much. I come from a family of extremes. I have folks who are long in oratory and others who have mastered the short quip. My Uncle Albert used to say that doomsday is that day that we get all of the government that we pay for. And it sort of sums up what the challenge of the American experience has been since we broke with the monarchy in Great Britain. Ladies and gentlemen, since Aristotle's recordings and observations, we have been taken with the conflict between the state and the individual, between individual liberty and the organized power of the state, between the reduction of the individual's moral responsibility and the absolute power of the state. The growth of the welfare state has provided us with 4 wrong ideas, and 4 threats to our first principles. The first is that the government can run the economy better than markets and individual decisions. The second is that government workers and professionals can make better decisions for your family than you. The third is that the work ethic is old and antiquated. This is a cultural We are rapidly becoming a culture where earning money doesn't entitle you to it, but wanting money does. That is a fundamental cultural threat to our first principles. And the fourth is moral relativism. If we go to the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, it starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Mount Garber used to say, that's a simple way of saying any knucklehead should be able to get this. That all of us are created equal. We're not all equal in size, we're not all equal in weight, we are not all equal in intelligence, we're not all equal in income. We're equal in that we're all accountable to our God, and we are equal in God's investment of human dignity in us. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, which means that our human rights, our basic rights, are not grants from government, but they're gifts from God. Given to us in a particular order, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is very difficult to enjoy liberty if you did. And in the limited powers of government, one of those powers is to protect innocent life. It is very difficult to enjoy or to pursue happiness if you're not free. That sums up the challenge when coupled with the four wrong-headed notions. I remember, General, I was at a small university in Ohio and I had gone to speak. Before I got on the podium, I had gone to the restroom, and scribbled there in the men's room was, "God is dead, Nietzsche." I got back there within 18 months. That was scratched out, and it said, "Nietzsche is dead, God." That is the struggle over first principles, because we have a president that wants to transform our market economy into a government-controlled economy. He wants to transform our family-centered society into a government-centered society. Most importantly, he wants to transform our national philosophy founded upon the primacy of the individual and the supremacy of God to one founded upon the primacy of the collective good and the supremacy of the central government. Mr. Obama's problem is that the Constitution of the United States stands in his way. The framers of the Constitution drew these words and these concepts together, understanding that they were erecting a wall designed to stop any president from fundamentally transforming our country. As we talk about first principles, I want to just sum up my opening remarks by saying I had a great uncle who was the first African American to win an Olympic gold medal. He did it in the 1924 games in Paris. He had qualified to run the 100 against Eric Liddell, the high hurdles, and the long jump. When he got to Paris, he was told that he couldn't run the 100-yard dash or the high hurdles because they were for white-only events. He, in fact, didn't run because of that ignorance. Liddell didn't run because the finals fell on the Sabbath, and he chose fidelity to faith. When my uncle came back to Cincinnati, he told my mom's generation that God had put him in a place where he would know just how important, much more important than the gold medal, fidelity to faith is. Ladies and gentlemen, the moral foundation that champions the responsibility of the individual, the primacy of God, and leads us to put a choke, a harness on the growth and expansion and intrusion of government in our lives is what the first principles are all about. The issue is whether we will take a stand and fight from the Atlantic to the Pacific, or whether we will tuck our tails and run and blow out the candles of hope. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to announce that reports of the demise of Stanton Evans were premature. He's actually with us today, and I'm very happy about that. Stan is described in his biography as a journalist. That, of course, is an understatement, shall we say. He has deep and powerful roots in American conservatism, going back to being assistant editor to the Freeman, his work at Human Events, and being associate editor at National Review for 13 years. He was the first chairman of the American Conservative Union. In 1977, he had founded the National Journalism Center. He is an important figure in conservatism, and in that time he's also written 8 books. His most recent, I would like to mention, Stalin's Secret Agents, The Subversion of Roosevelt's Government. I'm pleased to introduce him, Stanton Evans.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank all of you. It's an honor to be on this great panel with people I've admired for years and to be with you. I'm not going to go back to the ultimate first principles, but I'm going to talk about some political first principles that I think are important in the present day. And the first thing to confront, and Ken referred to this in his very eloquent remarks, is what we're up against right now. And I don't know about you, I get most of my news from the Jimmy Kimmel show. And, a week ago tonight, Jimmy Kimmel, are we all aware of Jimmy Kimmel, more or less? And are we aware of the sequester? Does everybody know about the sequester? You know, the 1% cut that will shut down civilization. Anyway, Jimmy Kimmel sent an inquiring reporter into the streets of New York to interview typical voters on those streets about the sequester. And I'm guessing from the way the interviews went that most of these voters were Obama voters. And the initial question was this to these citizens of New York: do you agree with President Obama's decision to pardon the sequester and send it to Portugal? The consensus seemed to be that this was a good decision. The first respondent said that she did agree with that it was a good decision because Portugal has a constitutional right to that protection. I guess that's in the Portuguese constitution. I don't know how that affects us, but that's what she said. There was one respondent who was a little shaky. He kind of supported the decision to pardon the sequester and send it to Portugal, but he said, I think we should have those jobs over here. The final question, the modulation of this was a slight change in the question, which was, what do you think of the fact that North Korea is developing its own sequester? So it wasn't an Obama question, it was a general information question. And the answer to that was very scary. It was scary. So these, I would remind you, are voters. Any three of you, your votes are canceled by these three people that are obviously a part of the Obama base. It's a three-legged stool. There are these people who Rush Limbaugh calls low information voters. I think that's, putting it mildly, And then, so that's the first leg of the stew. The second leg of the stew is illegal aliens. The third is dead people. We had a problem in Virginia where the governor, our Governor McDonald, and our Attorney General Ken and others tried to eliminate dead people from the rolls, about 10,000 of them from the voter rolls in Virginia. But this was obviously an effort at voter suppression. So I don't think that happened. Anyway, this is the coalition over which Barack Obama presides. It's what we're facing. What he is and what he is doing in his administration, I spent a lot of time in the last several years researching aspects of hard left, revolutionary, ruthless tactics. That's what we've got. That is what's going on here. This is by the numbers, recapitulation of every left-wing revolution that ever happened. It has nothing to do with policy. It has nothing to do with principle. It has everything to do with power. That's all it is about, and it is effective if it is not adequately opposed. You cannot deal with a revolutionary left cadre by compromise, trying to conciliate, be reasonable, reach out, and so forth. That's not going to work. The only thing you can do with people like that is to defeat them. And to defeat them, you have to fight them. Unfortunately, looking at the great panorama of our politics today, I see lots of evidence that we're not fighting, at least not effectively. The Republican Party seems to be totally defensive, hesitant, apologetic, back on its heels, not knowing what to do. And even some of our conservative commentariat that I see on television seem to have bought into this stuff about, well, Obama won the election, and so I guess we got to let him do whatever he's going to do. And I was talking to Ed Meese about this about a month ago. We were at a conference together, and I said, Ed, do you remember after Ronald Reagan won 49 states in 1984, right? And I read about that. Yes, I said, do you remember Tip O'Neill, who was then the Speaker of the House, the Democrats, saying, Reagan won the election. We just got to be more like Reagan. I don't remember that. And maybe I missed it, but no, that's not the way the Democrats played. They savaged Bob Bork. They savaged Ollie North. They went after Reagan himself. They went after Ed Meese. They did the whole schmear. They didn't roll over because Reagan won 49 states. They could have cared less. Their job was to try to bring them down, and they couldn't do it, but they tried. There was some discussion of the social issues here in the last panel, which I heard the end of. Very good panel. Social issues to some members of our party, the Republican Party, I think means blackballing somebody from a country club. That is their idea of a social issue. To those of us who are a little bit more blue collar, it means fighting for our traditional values, faith, and practices from our Judeo-Christian heritage. That's what it means to me anyway. I've often thought that looking at the scene today, that the Republican Party in Congress in particular should be staunchly pro-life because it is so often in the fetal position. You are not going to win any battles by lying down on the floor, sucking your thumb and saying, we lost, we lost, we lost. That ain't going to get it done. More than that, putting this in some historical framework, if we had had that kind of leadership, and we had people trying to tell us similar things back in the day, back in the 60s, when some of us got started in this stuff, there would have never been a conservative movement. if that's the kind of leadership we had from the commentary had and the politicians that did. We would have never had a Ronald Reagan presidency. We never had. Everything that is being said today was said back in the 60s about conservatives and about Ronald Reagan. That he couldn't win, that he was a loser, he was just a lightweight dunce, and that was said by people within the Republican Party. The same kind of people today who are attacking the Tea Party. Exactly the same kind of people. They're called rhinos now. We call them liberal Republicans, same thing. However, we did not accept, some of us at least, that rhetoric then, and don't accept it now, I don't think. I mentioned yesterday, and I had to repeat this. Some people heard my remarks yesterday, but most of you weren't there, so I'll repeat this. When we lost the election in 1964, I said, well, you were out there. We were Goldwater people back then. And we were crushed flat. We were wiped out in that election. We didn't start whining and say, oh, well, no. But the liberal media were telling us, that's it. It's anti-conservative. Forget it. It's over. Never going to happen. Forget it. And I said to the young people I talked to yesterday that it was very bad, very dismal times for us because we had no grief counselors. That's hard for some young people to relate to. We did not. We didn't have grief counselors. And I mentioned two other examples of that era. When you watch TV, and some of you heard this, we had no remotes. Or, if there were people who had remotes, they were very rich people. My family did not have remotes. If you wanted to change the TV channel, you had to get up out of your chair and walk over and turn it manually. I'm serious, you have to do this. Another example I cite often, the malls were not covered. If you went from the Gap to the Radio Shack, you were outdoors, man. It could be raining. We didn't know any different. That's the way we were raised. No, we were tough people. And we came out of that election fighting harder. We didn't give up. And out of that election came a person named Ronald Reagan, who gave a speech, the so-called time for choosing speech, and we all remember some of us of that, our demographic. And I remember sitting with my wife in our living room in Indianapolis, where I then was, and watching that speech and saying, that's the guy who's running for president right there. And a lot of other people thought the same thing. 2 years later, he ran for governor, and so it went. Ed Meese knows that much better than I do. I won't hold forth on that any further because he is the world's expert on it. We are in a much stronger position today in terms of our positions of strength than we were then. We had no positions of strength at all. In 1965, we have today. You would never know it, but we have a majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives. Hello. That's why there's a Speaker Boehner. I don't know if you make that connection there. That we have more Republicans than there are Democrats. That's just for some of the commentary I have to reflect on. We have 30 governors. 30 Republican governors. Most of them very staunch conservatives. That, by my old math, is 60% of all the governors in the United States. There are 24 states which have one-party governments. The governor and both houses of the legislature in the same, they have the same party. 24 are Republican, 12 are Democratic. And one could go on. So there is a lot there to build on if we will build on it and use it. And just say, well, we lost, we're losers. If you say that, you are a loser, but we should not be saying. Something else, I was interested in the demographic data of the preceding panel, because it ties in a little bit about fertility rates. How many of you were here for that discussion? And there was some question about the declining population birth rates for the United States. However, there is a differential within those data. The differential is between those who are of religious faith and practicing and those who are not. Those who are of religious faith and practicing have higher fertility rates. It is the unchurched, it is the irreligious, it is the purely secular who have lower fertility rates. I project those trends into the future, and to put it in very blunt fashion, the liberals are aborting themselves out of existence. That's what's going on. So, breed, baby, breed. And there's some other demographic. I'm almost done that, don't I? I'm getting restless here. Within the voting public as a whole, we're a lot of the Hispanic vote, Hispanic vote, Hispanic vote. Fine, reach out to the Hispanic vote. Bring in the Hispanic vote. Get all the Hispanic votes you can. The Hispanic vote is 10% of the voting population. 10. The evangelical vote, any guesses? 26%. The same people who told us we should reach out to the Hispanic voters saying, kick these evangelicals in the teeth. Forget these social issues. Just get them out of here. We don't want those. They're so embarrassing. I go to the country club, people sneer at me for pro-life. These data, taken together, there are many more, I'll stop here, are projection into the future, spell the inevitable defeat of liberalism. Just keep building on that base, and they're going to lose, we're going to win. There's more to say, but I will wrap up with this. Our Republican leadership needs to take the offense. And I conclude with a little anecdote about a family, modern family, a man and wife, and two sets of children, older teenage children and younger siblings who are 5, 6 years old. And as often happens in families like that, the younger children started imitating and picking up the language of the older children trying to be fluent. They got into some fairly, off-color language of doing this. So one day the father, the liberated household, comes down to prepare the breakfast for the children. He turns to the teenagers, he turns to the little boy, says, "What would you like for breakfast?" And the little boy says, "What the hell? I might as well have some cornflakes." The father is shocked. He reached out and smacks the kid in the face. He said, "We don't talk like that in this house. And I don't want to hear that again." And he turns to the little girl and says, "Now what would you like for breakfast?" She says, "You can bet your ass it won't be cornflakes." The moral of which is, if something bad happens to you, it's a good idea to know the reason for it. And I think I've given you part of that. Thank you very much.
Stan will be doing the floor show in the bar tonight at 7. Our next speaker is Bruce Fein. Bruce began the Reagan administration as Associate Attorney General in the Department of Justice before he became General Counsel for the FCC, and then was on the Hill working with the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran. Between 85 and well, recently, you might be familiar with his regular commentary columns for the Washington Times. He's the chairman of the American Freedom Agenda, and is also currently a principal of the Litchfield Group. His most recent book is Constitution in Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy. Bruce Fein.
Well, thank you. Following Stanton Evans is a little bit like following Demosthenes and hoping for an improvement. I want to discuss the final end of the state as the fundamental principle of the American Republic, and I don't think it's subject to debate. It was decided by those who fought at Valley Forge, later on at Cemetery Ridge, Omaha Beach. It's not subject to debate. And the founding idea behind our government, to be distinguished from private sector activity, was that the final end of the state was to make men and women free to develop their faculties. The glory of the Republic was liberty, not empire, not telling other countries what to do. It was liberty. And that all those mechanisms of government should be measured against that goal. Does it maximize and promote the individual liberty to develop their faculties without predation on others, or does it subtract from that goal? The idea is one of human dignity. We're all captains of our fate. We need to be morally accountable for our own destiny, for good or for ill. We did not want to be dependent upon government by others to drive our trajectory. And to implement this idea of the final end of the state, we drafted the Constitution, whose foremost principle, really perhaps the greatest idea in the history of civilization, is due process. Due process, the first recognition by man that he could be wrong. You need to hear two sides. We need impartial decisions before anyone is deprived of life, liberty, or property. Due process, the beginning of civilization itself. It's something that has been tarnished, destroyed under certainly this administration. And to give an example of how truly frightening the legal architecture under which we live is, you can examine the Justice Department's views of the executive authority of the occupant of the White House to use lethal force on anyone who he decides in secret creates some kind of danger somehow, somewhere, at some future time, to some undefined interest of the United States. Now, Ken spoke about Nietzsche and God being dead, and I once wrote an article about saying, well, God is alive. He sits in the White House and claiming the power to kill anyone he wishes by his unilateral decree. You can't get any higher than that. Indeed, it's a more harrowing authority than has ever been claimed by any tyrant, beginning with Genghis Khan, Ivan the Terrible. You can't even think of endowing any individual with that authority of life or death to be made in secret on one individual's decision alone. This is the United States of America that overthrew King George III in part because he was denying Americans a right to jury trial. If you're a peasant, you don't get any trial at all. The second major principle in our Constitution that advanced the final end of government was the notion of the limited authority of government. Now, why was that choice made? The founders understood that men in a state of nature, given ordinary depravities, would do very antisocial things. There needed to be some government. Otherwise, as Hobbes remarked in his Leviathan, life would be poor, brutish, nasty, and short. But they believed that the even greater danger was a government that was not controlling itself. That of all the evil individuals can do, they are dwarfed by the evils that government can perpetrate. Whether it's Mao's 100 million deaths or Stalin's 80 million or otherwise, you all know your history. And therefore they devised this system of limited government by enumerating only certain subjects that the government can operate on. In the United States Constitution, it's largely Article 1. And even more important, in order to check the excessive use of those limited authorities, they developed the idea of separation of powers. Separation of powers based upon the idea that men and women are not angels. If that were true, we'd need no government at all. But ambition needed to be made to counteract ambition. Indeed, it was said in the Federalist Papers that the very definition of tyranny was the combination of legislative, executive, and judicial powers in one branch or one person. The very definition of tyranny that provoked the American Revolution. And I say we now have an executive branch that has been endowed with the authority to play prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner to kill Americans. Every single branch of government combined in one. The definition of tyranny. Now, the response that the Constitution provided for such usurpation was simple. Article 2, Section 4 provided for impeachment and removal from office of those officials, including the President, guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And when the Constitutional Convention was discussing the impeachment power, Benjamin Franklin described it as a substitute for assassinating tyrants. The civilized way in which someone who has proven an untrustworthy steward of our liberties is removed from power. It's not the guillotine like Louis XVI. It's a civilized legal method for preserving our liberties. Now, unfortunately, it's used as something like HIV or AIDS. You just can't go near the impeachment authority. But that is the only check the Founding Fathers recognized that could contain executive branch abuses. Otherwise, it simply defies the Constitution with impunity if Congress will not step up to the plate. It was equally understood as a fundamental principle of our Constitution and our government was that we do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Those are the words of John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, in his July 4th, 1821 address to Congress. The Founding Fathers understood that there was an irreconcilability between permanent war and liberty. And James Madison explained that those powers that were initially conceived to address foreign dangers invariably come home to destroy domestic liberty. The Founders thus entrusted exclusively to Congress the decision to go to war, to cross the Rubicon from peace to war. A very momentous decision because, ladies and gentlemen, the defining earmark of war is it makes what customarily is murder legal. So it's a very, very important, careful decision that you want to make. It makes what's customarily murder legal. And therefore, Congress was given the exclusive authority to make that decision absent response to an actual attack, because the President has a conflict of interest. It was recognized and debated amongst all the Founders that in times of war, the President grows in power. The secrecy, the patriotism, the money, the appointments, the footprints in the sands of time. And if you looked at the history of war, it's been invariably initiated by executives, by monarchs, not by collective bodies. And this was one idea where those who were most in favor of the most muscular presidency, Alexander Hamilton, joined hands with the likes of James Madison, who was much more skeptical and said, yes, we cannot endow our president with the same authority as King George III or the monarch of England. And now we have a president who says, I can go to war unilaterally, anytime, any place, anywhere. He had his legal advisor at the State Department testify before the Foreign Relations Committee. We can blow up the world, and it's not war in the constitutional sense if it doesn't endanger our pilots or otherwise. We could send nuclear-tipped ICBMs all over the world. It's not war. I can do that unilaterally. These are just symptoms of what I would call a post-constitutional era. We are so far beyond the first principles of the Founding Fathers. It would be unrecognizable to those 55 delegates who sat in Philadelphia in 1787 and drafted what has been described as the Miracle of Philadelphia. So far beyond that we are in danger of self-ruination if something is not done to restore these final principles. In my judgment, we have a shelf life of no longer than 20 years. We will be run by a single executive. We will be reduced to vassalage, and all of our liberties will be the political indulgence of the President, none of them that we will be able to assert as a right in federal courts. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is frightening. Thank you.
On that cheery note, I'm very happy to introduce our last speaker, who was the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation. Ken had to catch a car, so thanks, Ken. Thank you very much. The Ronald Reagan Distinguished Fellow Emeritus at the Heritage Foundation. You all, of course, know him because of his very close association with Ronald Reagan, going back to the California Governor's Mansion in 1966, and then later as Attorney General in Ronald Reagan's second term. At Heritage, he built and created the Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, which I'm now happy to say is the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, headed up by David Addington, who's here this afternoon. He is the most decent man I've ever worked with, and I'm honored to be associated with him. And when it comes to first principles and many other things going on in this country, he is someone for whom we should be grateful. Ed Meese.
Thank you, Matt, for your very generous introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome. It's a real honor for me to be here with this distinguished panel of friends for a long time and people who really understand our republic. You know, Stan's story about the little girl reminded me of another one that I heard. It had to do with a situation that took place early in the month of February of this year. The father was sitting at his breakfast table, and his daughter came down dressed in a sloppy sweatshirt with jeans with a lot of holes in them. And he was quite concerned. She said, Susie, what's going on here? You're going to be late for school. You got to go back and get dressed. She says, oh, don't worry, Dad. There's no school today. It's President's Day. So the father said, testing this little sixth grader, said, Susie, do you know what President's Day is? And Susie said, yes, it's kind of like Groundhog's Day. The father was really confused. He said, what do you mean? Well, it's like this, Dad. It's the day when President Obama comes out of the White House, and if he sees his shadow, we have another year of unemployment. But we're talking about first principles. And the first principles that have been very well discussed here basically are those that are enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution by some very wise founders, as you heard, who were carefully prepared through their education and through their thinking to do what they could to institutionalize and preserve for the foreseeable future the idea of freedom, which is the basis, of course, for this republic. Well, it's unfortunate that we have seen, particularly in the past century, considerable erosion of that freedom. And because of that, it is because of the erosion of those first principles. It began really in earnest about literally 100 years or 1 century ago with the people who called themselves progressives and who hated the Constitution because they said it was an obstacle to what they could do for the people of America. But they really meant it was an obstacle to what they wanted to do based upon their own rather strange philosophy of statism and the kinds of things that could only be done by essentially a powerful central government. And so as a result, 1913, just 1 century ago, was a bad year for the Constitution. That was the year we got the income tax giving the central government its greatest ability to fund itself, and we also got a change in the way in which senators were elected. Before that, they were elected by the various states, and so that preserved the balance between the states and the federal government in terms of power. And when we had the direct election of senators, that took away then the ability of having them responsible basically to their states, which prior to that time were elected, they were elected through the state legislature, and instead they now were responsible to themselves only and to the electorate they represented, a very different picture than what the founders had intended. And of course today we have the continued erosion, perhaps right now more pronounced than I've seen it during my lifetime. We have a Congress, for example, where the former speaker, when asked about the constitutionality of one of the most important pieces of legislation which had the most to do with the oppression of the people, namely Obamacare, when asked whether that was constitutional, her reply is to the person who asked, "Are you serious? You know, what does the Constitution have?" In essence, she was saying to whether or not we have a particular piece of legislation. And this was the Congress also that in many ways, even today, within this week, where a senator seeking to impose a piece of legislation that has some real ramifications concerning its being consistent with the Second Amendment, when challenged by a hypothetical question about the Constitution, essentially refused to ask and gave a hyperbolic response to the other senator asking the question. In terms of the president, we have a president today who ignored the Constitution when he made a series of recess appointments when there was no recess. He evaded the Constitution by appointing a bunch of people known as czars who had authority normally reserved for cabinet officers who had to answer questions before the Senate and their confirmation process, and then through to both houses of Congress for their activities when in office. He trashed the Constitution, and particularly checks and balances, when he waived the work requirement for welfare recipients, despite a specific congressional enacted law against doing such a thing. And he shredded the Constitution when he essentially granted amnesty to a whole category of people in terms of illegal aliens without any congressional authorization. And then we've had the judiciary that likewise has done its bit to violate essentially the founders' concepts and those initial and those important first principles. We had a Chief Justice who only recently used a convoluted approach and, in my opinion, abuse of the Constitution to justify one of the greatest legislative acts of oppression of the people. That, of course, again, was Obamacare. And we had a court, by a 5-4 vote, that invalidated government by the people by overturning an initiative by the people of Colorado when they specifically passed an initiative by a majority of the people themselves, which affirmed God's definition of marriage and tried to make sure that the laws of Colorado conformed to that definition. Well, I believe that that is why it is critical that as we stand here at CPAC 2013, a location, a venue where the conservative movement and those who believe in the Constitution and the Declaration have traditionally mounted their efforts, as Ronald Reagan asked them to do in 1975 and in many of the other remarks that he made over the years. And that's why I believe that the reason that the overwhelming majority of the people in the United States believe we're on the wrong track is that we have indeed abandoned or violated those important first principles that the founders developed. And that's why, in order to change and to move in a different direction, we need to use this as a starting point to mobilize conservatives throughout the country, in all parties, that we can find them. And indeed, I think that the Reagan Democrats indicated to us that it's not just a one-party situation, but rather that when you really go back to something that resonates with the people in terms of protecting and regaining their freedom, that we find people across the partisan spectrum. And that's why the Tea Party, in my opinion, Tea Party groups have been so effective, is finding ordinary people. Many of them were, in fact, members of another party or independents who have banded together to restore the kind of a government that the founders initially established on the basis of the first principles. That's why we need to be sure that in 2014 we elect a Congress in both houses that is committed to those first principles, and we need to hold their feet to the fire after we have elected those members of Congress in both houses so that they will live up on the floor of the two houses to what they said during the election. We need to elect a president in 2016 who will fully fulfill the Constitution through his own actions and will also appoint judges to the courts who indeed will uphold constitutional fidelity and not judicial activism. And thirdly, we need to speak out in every instance that we can when the court does, when judges do engage in judicial activism. Believe it or not, judges are somewhat influenced by what the public thinks. And it's important that through letters to the editor, through other pronouncements, through positions of organizations and the like, that when the court goes wrong, we speak out and ask that the judiciary likewise be faithful to the Constitution. These are the things that I think, as a movement and as people who have indicated by their presence here in this hall, have signified their concern for the country and their wish to do something better and to have a better country. We can't wait for another Ronald Reagan. There are going to be other people that will likewise pick up the banner and carry it forward. We have a strong bench, as has been talked about here, among the governors and among many of the people now in the Congress itself. But we each have a responsibility to do what we can in order to make this come about. I believe that we can use the political first principles that have been talked about by speakers here and use that to regain the philosophical and constitutional first principles established by the founders. And if we can do that, we will take back our country and restore the freedom that the founders gave us. Thank you.
Unfortunately, it uses up our time, but with these wonderful comments about our Constitution today, I would just point out that in the back there's a couple of things, including a flyer that tells you about a lot of the first material we produce at Heritage, monographs and papers and books and all sorts of things. And the speakers are going to go outside and be able to answer some questions there that we get going through the schedule. So I thank you, and please join me in thanking them.